Okay, we're going to have a little look at foam and adding foam into bags. I'm not going to make a bag. I'm just going to show you some examples of some easier ways to use foam and talk a little bit about foam stabiliser. So I've got Styleville here. Now Styleville is approximately 5 millimeters thick. It is designed to be sewn through. It has a sort of almost like a nylon backing on both sides. I'm assuming it's nylon, I don't actually know, with foam between the two layers. And this is kind of a high density foam, so when you squash it, it comes back. So you can squash it down flat and it will come back. However, if you're making a bag and I'm just using scraps of fabric, which I haven't clearly cut in half, which I should have done. And I haven't interfaced this fabric either, so you would have foam and fabric on one side, foam and fabric on the other side. And when you go to construct your bag, you would put your exterior fabrics right sides together, which would give you this, it's fairly substantial thickness to get under your presser foot. Now, given that Styleville is 5 millimeters in thickness, that's 10 millimeters plus my fabric. Now if I were using faux leather, that might be even thicker. Now I'm not going to use my knee lift, I'm just going to use my ordinary riser, and immediately you can see, well, it doesn't fit. I mean, I can squash it down and push it in, but it doesn't fit. That's because most domestic presser foots on most domestic machines will go up about 6 millimeters. That is 10 millimeters. So the only way you're going to get it under is to squish it. Now that's perfectly acceptable, but for some machines, and if you've got more than just the 2 layers of foam plus your exterior fabrics plus any interfacing, you may have 4 layers of faux leather. Depending on what bag you're making, you can see that the layers very quickly build up. Now I'm just going to, I've used my knee lift and my knee, now whilst that's how far my foot will go up with just the doofer, what do you call it, this bit. But I can raise my foot quite a considerable bit further using the knee lift, which takes it up 13 millimeters. So actually I can easily get that underneath my foot. And I use foam right to the edge of my fabrics because of that. So I'm just going to stitch through that. You can see it sews quite easily. There's no problem sewing it. It sews well. And if I open up that seam, you can see this would probably be the side or the bottom of my bag. You can find that it gets a little bit bulky inside. So most patterns will tell you to trim off the foam from your seam allowance, which will make your seams sit much nicer. And if you've got a heavy duty machine or an industrial machine or a machine that's perhaps not necessarily, I don't think there is such a bag that's actually a machine that's actually designed for bag making, but there are some machines that are more suited to bag makers, more suited to the bulk and the heavy layers that we use. So there we go. I've removed the foam from my seam allowance, and when I open that up, my seam, which would be perhaps on the, look at that, perfect pattern matching. Who knew? I couldn't do that in a million years if I tried to. Will sit nice and smooth, nice and flat. You haven't got too much bulk on the inside, so when you perhaps come to do something like your top stitching, and you're, for example, you're going to have perhaps folded over and you'll be top stitching around the top here, there's not going to be all the bulk of that foam that was in the seam allowance causing you grief and causing you skip stitches. So if you've got a good quality machine that's man enough for it, just cut your foam to the same size as your exterior pieces. However, that's not necessarily the only way to do this. So I'm now going to show you Another option. Now, if you have a machine that does a zigzag, you can do this. 2 more exterior pieces, 2 more pieces of foam. These bits are a bit bigger. Again, I haven't interfaced my exterior pieces, but my foam, I've done something too. Now, I don't have a zigzag machine that I use all the time. I've got one, but it's underneath my table, so I don't get it out. But what you can do is you can do either a zigzag or a straight stitch all the way around the outside of the piece of your foam, and you can see what that does. It reduces the thickness. You can see it just compresses the sides. Which means that it's much, much easier to get underneath your presser foot. I haven't reduced the size of this. This is still the same size as my fabric. So let's just, still haven't cut these 2 pieces apart. Let's just add my foam to my fabric. And I do the same on this piece. Now, a lot of patterns will tell you to sew baste your foam onto your fabric, which I would do, but I'm not going to for this because basically I'm just trying to show you how this will reduce the thickness. And then we would put our 2 panels together. So we've got our fabrics right sides together and our foam inside. And you can instantly see how much thinner that is. The bulk is still in here in the middle, but the outside bit where you're actually going to sew is really quite flat. So I mean, I've done my stitching around the outside, and because I only have a straight stitch machine, I have just done rows of straight stitching, nothing fancy. So you could do a zigzag if you had a zigzag machine, works exactly the same. And if you do that sort of, it depends on what the seam allowance is on the bag or purse you're making. If you're doing something that's got a 1/4 inch seam allowance, then zigzag round so that you've got 1/4 of an inch around the outside of your foam, flattened, compressed. Now, if I lift my foot up with my presser foot lift, you can see that easily goes under my presser foot, whereas before it really wouldn't. So I can now drop my presser foot down, stitch my seam, now you're not going to be able to see the stitching because it's the same colour as the stitching that's actually on the around the outside of the foam, but you can see how much thinner it is. And from that point you can then do exactly the same thing again. You can lift up your foam, remove any of the foam from the seam allowance, on both sides to get a nice flat seam on the outside. But you can see the bits of foam that I'm removing are really, really flat compared to what I was removing on the first one. So 5mm, maybe 1mm. It's a huge amount of difference. It's a huge amount of difference underneath your presser foot. I don't need to remove the other side. You know where we're going with that. You can see what's happened. But it does help to reduce the bulk in the seams and make it easier for you to sew. If you've got a machine that doesn't have a knee lift, then you don't want to have to shove things underneath the, oh, excuse me, I've got a tickle, I'm going to sneeze in a minute. You don't want to have to shove things under the presser foot. So that's another way to use foam. And I have one more for you. But I just need to grab my iron because I forgot to bring it over. Oops. Right, here we go. Right, so this is the third method, and I do use this one. Now, if you would rather not have any foam in the seam allowance, Trim your foam down so that it is, depending on what your seam allowance is, if it's 3/8 of an inch, then trim it down so it's 3/8 of an inch smaller than your exterior piece. If it's 1/4 of an inch, make it so that it's 1/4 of an inch smaller than your exterior piece. And you can see there that the foam is substantially smaller than my exterior piece. Now, if you wanted to, you could actually just stop at that point and use some spray adhesive on the back of the foam and just spray and then attach it to your fabric. I personally, I do use spray adhesive, but I find that it can sometimes, it doesn't stay put. Most spray adhesives are temporary spray adhesives that I would use perhaps for positioning, wadding or batting on a quilt. So you want them to be able to be removed. So if you're going to use a temporary spray adhesive, then it's never going to stick permanently. So yeah, I just find that it works, but it's not really an ideal solution. So I put my foam centrally on there, and what I'm going to do is I take strips, and these are literally scrap strips of woven fusible interfacing. If I turn this around this way, you'll be able to see better, I think. And I place that so that the edge is right on the edge of the fabric. And I press so that it adheres. And then once I've got it adhered to the fabric, I will then use my iron to press the other half of that strip. And these are 1-inch strips, literally cut from my scraps, so that it covers, it goes onto the top of the foam. I'm going to do it on the other side. So just lay the woven fusible so that it's actually against the edge of your fabric. If you're worried about having too many layers of woven fusible in the seams, then you can actually cut your fusible interfacing a fraction smaller and just put it in the centre. So by the time you put this extra bit on, you've actually just got woven fusible interfacing right the way across. So I've adhered it to the outside. And it fuses quite easily to foam, whether that be a thick foam like this, which is, say, the Styleville, or a thinner foam such as Headliner. Although for most machines, I think they would get through Headliner. And I literally, when I have scraps of woven fusible interfacing, I will literally cut strips like this. I've got a box of strips. It doesn't have to be done all in one strip. You can do it in sort of little bits and bobs if that's what you've got, because it's never going to be visible. Let's use that bit because that's about the right length. Do you mind your fingers? Because, you know, ironing your fingers is never a good thing. But you can see there that our piece of foam is now fully attached to our exterior fabric, which I haven't pressed, but it's not in the seam allowance. So when you stitch, you will only be stitching through the exterior fabric. So if you can't get foam under your presser foot, or your machine just doesn't like going through it, then this is the way forwards, definitely. You don't even have to do the entire outside. You can do the top and the bottom, and then perhaps just do like small strips that just go every couple of inches along the sides, or the opposite way round. As long as that foam doesn't move anywhere, it's going to do the job. And the other option, of course, is fusible foam. Fusible foam. Now, for my money, and I have tried fusible foam, it's just not worth the aggro, because it just wrinkles everything. It doesn't wrinkle when you apply it, generally speaking, but when you go to turn your bag, when you're kind of compressing your bag and stuffing it in through pockets or holes in the bottom of your lining, the foam creases terribly and doesn't ever really, the creases will not come out. So I avoid fusible foam at all costs. I have on occasions bought, I did once by mistake, by double-sided fusible, which was fusible on both sides. I could not for the life of me figure out what to do with it, so I ended up buying some cheap polycotton and literally fusing cheap polycotton to both sides to make it non-fusible. I didn't want to waste the foam because it was expensive, but I didn't want to use it fusible. I just didn't know what to do with it as a double-sided fusible thing. It just didn't make any sense to me. So there you have it. You have ordinary foam going right up to the edge of your fabric, stitched through and then trimmed away from the seams without any extra treatment of the foam at all. We have, excuse me, foam that has been stitched down and compressed all the way around the outsides. Then you could say basted or attached, sew basted onto our fabric. I didn't sew baste, we know that. And then trimmed away at the seam allowance to create the seam so that you've got a less thickness in your stitch line. Or we have our fleece that's been fixed to the back of our fabric, so to the wrong side of our exterior fabric, using woven fusible interfacing. You could even get away with using a non-woven in part with this, really, to be honest, although I don't tend to use non-woven very much, so it's not something I have scraps of. I have lots and lots of scraps of woven fusible interfacing, but that's basically foam and different ways to kind of fit it and to keep it out of your seam allowance and to reduce the bulk, because not every machine's got 13mm worth of clearance under the presser foot. So those are some ideas. I'm sure there are other ideas, and I know that not everything will suit everybody. I mean, I go for the first one because I know my machine can manage it, but not all machines are made equal. And sometimes it's just easier to do a little bit of extra prep work to get a really good finish at the end. So there we go, foam for you.